Oh.
Nepal is staring at another possible flood disaster. Just days after a deadly wall of water tore through the Bhotekoshi river system, China has now issued a fresh warning. A newly formed barrier lake near the Nepal-Tibet border is overflowing and authorities fear it could breach within the next 3 days. If that happens, a massive surge of water could race downstream, threatening communities already battered by the floods. The warning comes as Nepal is still struggling to recover from the destruction triggered on August 26. A glacier collapse sent a powerful wall of water into Nepal's Bhotekoshi river. The sudden surge swept through the river system, leaving a trail of destruction and casualties. And on the Chinese side of the border, the same day brought another disaster. A massive mudslide buried the Jirong port crossing, disrupting a key border route between China and Nepal. Now, with the region still reeling, another natural threat has emerged. The newly formed lake is being closely watched because it sits upstream near the Nepal-China border. The lake has already started overflowing, but the biggest fear is a breach. If the natural barrier holding back the water gives way, the resulting flood pulse could move rapidly downstream through the river system. And that means areas that have barely begun recovering from the previous disaster could once again find themselves in the path of raging waters. Let's take a look at the timeline of the disaster.
On August 26, a catastrophic flood tore through the Bhotekoshi River Valley near the Nepal-China border, devastating communities and sending destruction more than 170 kilometers downstream. But here is what makes this disaster so terrifying. There was almost no warning, and at first authorities thought Nepal had been hit by an earthquake. But the real story was even more extraordinary. It began high in the Himalayas. At around 8:37 in the morning, seismic instruments detected a powerful signal. It looked like an earthquake, but according to the US Geological Survey, there was no conventional earthquake causing this disaster. The signal came from something moving across the mountain, a massive collapse of ice and rock. Imagine a huge section of a glacier suddenly breaking apart. That collapsing ice slammed into the mountainside, dragging rock and soil with it. And then gravity took over. The debris accelerated downhill. As it entered the river system, it began gathering more and more material. Water, mud, boulders, trees, and shattered earth. What started high on the mountain became a gigantic moving wall of destruction. By the time it reached the valley below, witnesses were seeing something that looked less like a normal flood and more like a tsunami made of dirt. Early estimates suggested the debris wave may have reached around 30 meters high, and it didn't stop. It raced down the Bhotekoshi River Valley, swallowing roads, bridges, buildings, and everything else in its path. At the Girong border crossing, the destruction was enormous. Villages were devastated, people were swept away, and the disaster crossed an international border, affecting both Nepal and Tibet. Nepali authorities later reported at least 162 bodies recovered, while 3 deaths were reported on the Tibetan side. Hundreds of people remained unaccounted for. Among those missing were hundreds of tourists and foreign nationals, including Americans, Australians, Canadians, and others. But now comes the biggest question: what actually caused the glacier to collapse? And this is where the story becomes much more complicated. One possibility in Himalayan disasters is something called a glacial lake outburst flood, or GLOF. Here's how that works. As glaciers melt, water can accumulate behind natural dams made of ice, rock, and sediment. These lakes can become enormous. If the natural dam suddenly fails, billions of liters of water can escape in minutes. The result can be a devastating flash flood. Nepal has experienced this type of disaster before, but early satellite analysis suggests this was probably not a classic glacial lake outburst flood. Instead, evidence points toward a direct collapse involving the glacier itself. In other words, the ice didn't simply release a lake. The glacier appears to have helped trigger the landslide, and that distinction matters because the Himalayas are changing. The Himalayas contain one of the largest concentrations of snow and ice on Earth, sometimes called the planet's third pole. These glaciers feed rivers that millions, even billions of people depend upon across South Asia and China. But rising temperatures are changing these mountains. Glaciers are retreating, ice is melting, and something else is becoming increasingly important: permafrost. Think of permafrost as the frozen glue holding parts of a mountain together. It is rock, soil, and ice that has remained frozen for years, sometimes centuries. When temperatures rise, that frozen material can begin to thaw. And when the ice inside a steep mountain slope disappears, the slope can become weaker. Rocks that were once locked together can begin shifting. Cracks can widen, and enormous masses of unstable material can suddenly give way. But there is an important warning here. Scientists cannot simply say, climate change caused this disaster. Not yet. The exact trigger of this particular collapse is still being investigated. A disturbance such as a small earthquake, rockfall, intense rainfall, or structural failure could potentially initiate a collapse. What climate change can do is alter the background conditions. It can make glaciers smaller, it can weaken frozen ground, it can destabilize slopes, and that can make some mountain systems increasingly vulnerable to sudden failure. That is why Nepal's disaster is bigger than one terrifying morning. It is a warning about how rapidly changing mountain environments can behave. The Himalayas have always been dangerous, but as the climate warms, scientists are asking a frightening question. Are some of these mountains becoming more unstable than the communities living beneath them can afford to ignore? Nepal's answer came on August 26, and it arrived as a tsunami made of dirt.